Welcome to SurrealDB stream number 19, where we're talking about embedded scripting functions. My name is Alexander Fredriksson. I'm a data evangelist here at SurrealDB, and I'm joined by software engineer Mies. And we'll be kind of covering the scripting functionality in SurrealDB, what it is, what you can do with it, and why we had it. And the first thing I want to share at the moment is just kind of like briefly go through what we're covering and why we're covering. So there has been like recently announcement from a major database, MySQL, where they're introduced JavaScript support in their database. And this has kind of like caused some virality and outrage in the data community. And we kind of like looked at that, and we have seen that we actually implemented it way before MySQL did. And in MySQL, they are using the GraalVM VM engine, which is a Java development kit. And we have done things differently. And what we have done is used QuickJS. But we have the kind of person that's been implementing that on the stream, Mies here. So I'll actually put it over to him about what did we actually, like why did we pick QuickJS, and what is the project he was working on? So Mies, when you were kind of like looking over the JavaScript ecosystem, why choose QuickJS?
Well, QuickJS, like there are many JavaScript runtimes, V8, SpiderMonkey. They are very fast, but they have the problem of being rather heavy, like megabytes of binary, and like every startup takes a lot of time because they need to do extra work to make their functions run fast. Like my original when I started working with QuickJS was for a game. I just needed some configuration files, and like
Yep.
I needed something that was lightweight, quick to start up. So QuickJS was the choice for that because that's basically what that function is about. It's slower to execute, but it has fast startup times, and so you can run each function very quickly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you kind of created the Rust wrapper, one of the kind of like Rust wrappers for QuickJS. How
Yeah.
difficult was it to actually do that?
Well, it's kind of there are some challenges because like it's a C library, and there is lots of unsafe things. Like if you don't use a QuickJS right, you will segfault, and in Rust that is not done. So there are like lots of things working around with lifetimes, making sure that you can't use two different runtimes at the same time.
Right.
Interchange objects between them. That's all. That was all kind of challenges that you needed to solve. And there are a lot of people who already looked at that, and like our QuickJS kind of is inspired by existing libraries, which also use interpreters. Like there is mLua, which has like kind of similar problems, which is wrap around Lua interpreters. So that's I kind of looked at that and like kind of designed around that, and then like designed the whole safe thing for interacting, handling callbacks, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. No, that's definitely really cool, and we'll get into kind of like the examples of like how it's implemented and how it's used. But before that, I just wanted to point out that the kind of like AWS has this kind of low latency runtime that they're kind of like wanting to use for the kind of like lambdas and stuff like just like Mies, you're talking about how it is low latency, very easy, fast to start. And so this is kind of like an experimental package that uses the R-QuickJS wrapper that you created. So it's kind of like really cool to see that it's not just a kind of like small and upcoming database that thinks this is actually like a cool and good thing, but you have like a major company like AWS that actually is saying like, hey, yeah, this is definitely something that is worth looking into.
Yeah, I was rather excited when I noticed that they were using my library. Like,
yeah,
feels good to be like kind of validated in a way.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. But also just kind of like for those in the audience and those watching, like if you have any questions about kind of like embedded JavaScript runtime and how we're doing it, feel free to post about it or any other topic. But then kind of like coming back into kind of like embedding it in a database. Um, what does it mean to actually like have it embedded in a database? Like how do you embed something like that in SerialDB?
Yeah, well, like with SerialDB, there are a bunch of challenges. Like first of thing is SerialDB has a lot of like asynchronous work. Like we're doing a lot of like non-blocking I/O. So we need like ArcGIS also needed to support that well, and that's one of the things I also worked on, like integrating JavaScript promises with Rust futures, so that you can cast them back and forth and have them wait like on each other, so that it all meshes nicely, and like, you get the non-blocking I/O also in JavaScript. That's one of the things that was the challenge also with like for every query you can do queries from the scripting functions which need to wait on I/O. So you get a JavaScript promise back, and that JavaScript promise then need to bubble up to the rest of the database so that everything can wait correctly. So that's kind of
yeah, no, it is definitely like a lot of the stuff that we're doing is kind of very kind of like innovative, and there are always kind of like edge cases that we're figuring out. And there was even, if I'm remembering correctly, like an edge case that we found in the QuickJS itself, based on the stuff that we were doing using with it. But I guess also kind of like we've kind of talked a little bit about the like what it is and kind of like some challenges with implementation. But let's also kind of like jump into some examples of how we can actually use this. So here we can see the Serialist interface, and we can see a create query that we're using here. And we are essentially creating a person table, and we're setting this field to be a JavaScript function. And so within that JavaScript function, we are then kind of like returning this array and then mapping it so that you can see the output is generated here. And the reason why you would do something like this is, for example, that in SerialDB, we don't have a mapping function at the moment. Or there might be kind of like other cases where you want to have like greater extensibility, or you want to have like some custom logic. And in many cases, and especially in my career in data engineering, you have a bunch of like templating languages put on top of it. Like dbt has the Jinja 2 templating language, so you kind of like template SQL. One of the things I've personally find really interesting with these embedded JavaScript functions is that you have kind of the very cool JavaScript runtime within the database. So you actually don't need a templating language. But from your perspective, do you have any perspective, any opinion on, templating languages or stuff like that, or like embedded stuff?
Well, for me, when I've used it, I find it also very useful because, like, for one thing, I'm familiar with JavaScript, so like some things I just you can kind of use it as an escape hatch when learning SerialQL. Like sometimes you learn that you can actually still do it in SerialQL, but sometimes like just moving to a JavaScript function is easier. And also like SerialQL, you can do a lot of things with those, but it's still a query language, and like some things are just easier to implement in the scripting. Some like difficult function where you need to do some calculations are just easier to do in the scripting language.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there wasn't like example we actually had from the community, where there was a person that wanted to do kind of like dynamic fields. So you have kind of in your select statement, you're selecting from a field, and then you want to have that dynamic because like you essentially the flexibility in you often take this kind of like things out and you put it in ORM to kind of like have this flexibility of, you don't want to have just like static queries. You might want to choose this field or that field or whatever. And one of the ways of doing that is previously in JavaScript, where we actually have a SerilDB function that we're creating here. And then inside that function, we have a JavaScript function that is essentially dynamically selecting this link or like this field. And you can see here when we create a record of Pablo Picasso, and then we can return this record here or like select this dynamically. So if I now change this to last name, or just like take one, you can actually use that. But it's interestingly enough, this kind of community Wemper was like, yes, this is possible to do with the JavaScript functions, but there has to be a better way of doing this. And he actually raised a feature request which got implemented as a PR. And from that kind of like community feedback, we actually created these fields where you can do the same thing. You can like pass in an array of things, and now you can like dynamically select it, just like in the JavaScript functions. So it's kind of like a really cool way of like you say, you have the JavaScript as an escape hatch, but some things actually like also make sense to bring in the query language itself.
Yeah.
But I was also curious, do you have any opinion about like what's the boundary? Like, is like should we bring a lot of stuff in the query language, or should we have a lot of stuff in the JavaScript?
Well, I think like if you need to do some complex calculation, like I don't know, you need to do like some analysis, financial analysis, where you have some complex function where you need to calculate a bunch of fields, and that I think that might be better to do in a JavaScript function. That's what the scripting is currently optimized for, while the query language is more optimized for selecting a bunch of fields and then doing one operation on all those fields at the same time. So there is a bit of a trade-off. Like I also see your question in the chat for XK about the performance. Like there is obviously a performance impact. Moving between SerialQL and scripting, there is a boundary. Like types need to be translated into what the JavaScript runtime expects, and then once the JavaScript runtime is done, it needs to be translated back. So that does impact performance. There is no way around that. But like if you have need to do some for loop, or have some like long running operation, that might be better to do in the scripting function, because the scripting function is optimized for that. Well, like for loops, for like reassigning a param in a for loop is not. SerialQL is not that great in that, because that's not what it's like designed for. It's not really a scripting language; it's primarily a query language. So it's kind of like, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to do a complex calculation? Maybe scripting languages are better for. Maybe the scripting function is better for. Are you trying to query things? Then maybe just stick to SerialQL.
Yeah, it's true. I think one of like the key things that we're aiming with SerialDB is this kind of like flexibility, and that takes many forms. So here we, for example, have these kind of like examples of interrupt. So we have like various stages of interrupt, where on the one hand you can have this conversion. So you can actually have create a new date in JavaScript, and then it's automatically converted to a SerialDB date time. so you're essentially having like from the JavaScript and then going to the serial QL. The opposite is also like possible, where here you in the JavaScript function, you're calling a kind of serial QL function. So you kind of have the flexibility to do both ways depending on what is best for your use case. But I guess, Mies, if you could shed some light on this kind of like automatic type conversion, like what is going on behind the scenes when we do these types of things?
So yeah, well, we have some basic like the JavaScript functions have their own types. Like date is, for instance, like a bunch of types we have implemented in Rust, so they can basically be straight converted to JavaScript types. Our QuickJS allows that implement types, JavaScript types in Rust, so that you can have that interoperability. Like some things are kind of, there are some kind of complexities with numbers, for instance. Like numbers in JavaScript are always 64-bit floats, which there is some difficulty with converting those, because in SerialQL we can have also 64-bit integer or decimals. So like when we convert, when that happens, it goes to big ints in JavaScript, for instance, and then big ints can also be turned back, and that's kind of how we're doing numbers. Apart from that, like most types can almost straight be complete. Like a SerialQL object will just be turned into a JavaScript object, and JavaScript object will just be turned into SerialQL object back. So that's
right.
It's kind of rather flexible and like in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess on that topic, I just want to kind of like point out that kind of like you have this kind of like all the time where you're talking about like object impedance mismatch, where like you're converting, say, like MySQL, like from rows and columns to objects and arrays. You need to map that somehow. But like you made a great point that like we have objects, JavaScript has objects, and like that kind of like flows a little bit better, right?
Yeah. SerialQLs maybe more object-oriented query languages, maybe more better suited to like these scripting functions, because they translate better to like JavaScript objects.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And let's see, we have a question here in the comments. So why not JavaScript? Why JavaScript? Why not Python, Elixir, or any other dynamic language? Yeah, that is definitely a good question. So JavaScript is relatively popular for kind of like embedding, and also kind of where you would use SerialDB. JavaScript actually might make a lot of sense, but when it comes to, say, like Python or other dynamic languages, it is and has historically been very difficult to find a very optimized implementation for it. Like there is like MicroPython, and there are a bunch of other Python implementations. Like even Postgres came with a PL Python way to write these kind of like stored procedures in Python. But if you actually look at the Postgres documentation, at the bottom of the page, it say like, please don't do this. Like, we don't actually think it's a great idea. So you have some kind of like, you have some people doing it in the industry, but it's nowhere near as kind of like stable and as performant as we see with the JavaScript ecosystem. But do you have any other thoughts on this, Mies?
Yeah, like personally, I think JavaScript is like it's widely known, so a lot of people use it because it's the language of the web, and like I think JavaScript has the sweet spot of having like some complexity, allowing you to do abstractions with objects, but also being simple enough that you can have a kind of easy, kind of fast interpreter. Like Python has a lot of like complex syntax and a lot of it makes it just harder to implement a fast interpreter for it.
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think we actually have an example to kind of like showcase why it's probably not a good idea. So we have here, let me go to, I think it was not this one. No, okay, I don't have the exact example here, but we have in our documentation, which you can look at, we have ways of using async and fetch and those types of built-in functions in. Oh, actually, I do have it now. I'll bring it up. So we have here the built-in functions where you can actually use SerialQL in JavaScript in SerialQL. And this might sound a little bit crazy at first, but as we're kind of like focusing on like flexibility, the reason why this exists is because people find it useful. And kind of like having the availability to do it means that you not necessarily have to integrate like third-party systems, or you have to like move the data everywhere. And so having a lot of this kind of flexibility in kind of like SerialDB makes sense. Not for everybody, and that's why we have the option to completely disable any scripting functions if you don't need them. But if you think of it in a way that every query that gets sent to SerialDB goes through our authentication layer, and so your data is essentially secured within kind of like the boundary of SerialDB, and within that you can have the flexibility of the JavaScript query syntax versus integrating a third-party service and kind of sending it over the wire somewhere, and then kind of like having to secure many things at like different fronts. It can be a little bit crazy to kind of when you see it, but like it definitely is useful. But on that point as well, when it comes to kind of like async and kind of like all that kind of stuff, like JavaScript has a far better implementation in that than Python currently, specifically around like Python has like the global interpreter lock and kind of like not really true async IO in that sense. But yeah, it's just great to see all the love for SerialQL as well. We have definitely been taking great care to make sure it's both like simple, easy to understand, but also like really flexible. And when you need more flexibility, there is this JavaScript kind of like escape hatch, and we definitely like take a great ideas from there and like implement them in the SerialQL language when they make sense. So let's explore another example here where we go into the arguments. So in traditional SQL, you don't have the kind of like arguments as such. And so we had added this let statement that allows you to have variables like you would have like let variables in JavaScript. And these actually are interoperable with the JavaScript functions. So you can define this kind of like parameter or variable here in SerialQL, and then you can use it in the JavaScript function. And so this opens up quite a lot of flexibility where you can actually run a query, get the result of that query, store that in a parameter, and then use the result of that in a JavaScript function. And that essentially allows you to, like, say, for example, you want to do like composable stuff, or you kind of like do this typical case where you have an ORM that kind of like grabs some data from the database, does some manipulation, and puts it back into the database. In this example, the data never leaves the database. It's all kind of like running internally. And so that kind of like escapes a lot of this network latency that you typically have. And so with an ORM, you also might have like this n+1 query problem where it's kind of like fetching a bunch of data and then like you're not needing the data and then kind of like doing all these kinds of things. even if you kind of like write less optimal JavaScript, just the fact that it's not going like maybe across the world or even just over the internet means that it's actually performing better. Do you have anything to add here, Mies?
Yeah, it's very useful. Like I really like how you can compose like these functions and just like use them like as functions are like use like have arguments. Yeah. I think I'm still looking like if you can see the example, there is some things I currently have some complaints about, like how you need to extract the arguments from the argument string. I am actually working on making that a bit more. I think I think I can change it so that you just can use the dollar value, so that you don't have to extract them again from the arguments. But that's something I'm still working on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just kind of like on the topic of things we're working on, we definitely have like a lot of exciting stuff coming later this year that we're working on, and yeah, a lot more superpowers that you can do in due course. So yeah, there definitely are some kind of like edge cases, and like you might run into issue here and there. But we're definitely making it better, and appreciate like all the feedback that we get, and very appreciative of the feature requests, bug requests, any comments or how we can improve. Another way I wanted to kind of like also showcase and kind of like shout out to the unknown who has contributed this use case in the community is we can actually use functions in assert statements. So like when you're defining a table, you can even use functions there. So here we are asserting that like a value has to be 42, and then in just normal SerilQL, you can like insert stuff and you kind of get those assertions. Now, this is a very, very, very simple example, and you actually don't need the JavaScript functions to have that, since we have asserts also in SerilQL, and you can do the same thing. However, this is just to kind of like showcase that if you had some like very complicated, very specific logic that you really needed in the kind of definition of the table or in the assertion, or there is this kind of like things that we don't support yet, there is the possibility of using the JavaScript functions there as well. So let's.
Yeah, you can just kind of use them as values basically you can use them on where conditions. You can basically, I believe, basically anywhere you want to have a value, like an expression in SerilQL, you can just use a function there. So their use is well flexible.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and one thing I also want to point out, if you kind of like go back to the interrupt example, is that when we're thinking about like how this is used in practice, we want to make it kind of like as simple as possible for you to kind of like understand what's going on. And we've also wanted to make sure that things are secure, and then things add up, and everything is working correctly. So if you have any example that you really would like to see, like let us know about it. But also in what we can do with this, what can't we do with this? Like, can you import packages into this? Like here we're importing a SerilDB package, but what about like external packages?
Not at the moment. You could always insert it directly into your source code, but I don't think you want to do that. But
right.
At the moment, we don't have a way to do that. Like, you could do some complex. You could store it as a string and use eval, but I'm also not that sure if you want to do that. But we don't have like you can the only import that's currently available to scripting functions are the imports of SerilDB query and that kind of stuff. Like
Yeah.
exposed on the global object, but like you can basically call any function that is defined in SerialQL. You can call from the scripting functions, and there are the additional methods of query. What's the other value? I
fetch.
believe it's called. Yeah.
Yeah.
Run a query in the database and calculate a SerialQL value, like a parameter, something respectively. So there are some limitations.
Yeah, true. I just want to mention also like in the limitations, some of those are good limitations. Like I remember the example of like LeftPath, where like half of the internet was like importing this package, which basically like could be implemented in one JavaScript function, and then when he removed it, like a lot of things broke. And I guess like having a little bit more lockdown means that you're not kind of like you don't have these kind of like supply chain vulnerabilities, since that like everything that is implemented is actually implemented by you at this point, or is implemented by a serial DB function. And so you kind of like are aware of what is happening. So that's definitely not a bad idea, I think, at all. So going back to kind of like a simple example here. So like you said earlier, we kind of like implemented a for statement in SerialDB, where we're kind of like have some syntax around it, and we're kind of like improve it how it works. And before we had this kind of like for statements in JavaScript, and definitely that is more optimized at the moment. And I know like in regular SQL, you don't have any of those. But in your mind, where do you kind of like see where we can expand on this? Like, is there any features that you think like we really should have that we don't have yet?
So for the scripting functions or the SerialQL?
The scripting functions.
So like what are we talking about? Like new languages or like extra features?
Right.
Yeah.
No. No. Yeah. Need to clarify that. So essentially, like for example, we have had discussions about like should we add map to SerialQL, and like how far are we going into kind of like making it a fully scripting language? And there are definitely different opinions, there. But is there any kind of like one thing that you think is very interesting?
Oh yeah. So when I think of SerialQL, I still think of it as a more flexible query language. So what I think is like it should like primarily be good at working on large arrays, large lists of values, and so that's what I think we should optimize for. And so you will always have like things where the interpreter we're building for SerialQL might be better at one thing, like operating on large arrays of like similar looking values, like queries which are all similar looking values. And then our scripting functions might be better on like doing a complex where you have a bunch of different variables which all need to change based on like a for loop or a while loop, and a scripting function might be better at doing that. So I think that there are like scripting functions can remain good at like being like for actual scripting, having those variables, and like we can have SerialQL be good for querying your data, filtering it, sorting it, ordering it, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I definitely agree with that. So we have a question here from the community. Can I save those functions with define function statement? And yes, you actually can. So I have this example, which kind of shows that. So we have the example here where we're using the SerialQL define function. And here we have the select field. And within that SerialQL define function, we are also defining a JavaScript function. And now that is essentially accessible as a serial QL function. So that's kind of like how you can essentially like package those, if you will. You have any more thoughts to add there, Mies?
Yeah, I think we might be able to take a look at making that, because it's kind of strange. I have to admit that the syntax is here kind of strange, because you're actually creating the function inside another function and then calling it immediately, which might be a bit confusing. So there might be an argument for having like a direct way to just define those functions. But that was something we would have to take a look at, because that would require some syntax. What? Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. No, thanks for the question. Yeah, there's definitely a bunch of stuff that we could do, and just kind of like going back to different approaches of doing it. In the MySQL way, they kind of like just added a like language JavaScript instead of like saying language SQL for the defined functions. And so yeah, we are definitely open towards that, to kind of like seeing what the community wants to build with this. And also, reason why we wanted to kind of like do this stream is to kind of like show that, like, hey, this is actually possible, and we actually haven't talked about it as much as we should. And so kind of like getting it out there, like this is actually possible to do. And on that note, one thing that we kind of have been working on is kind of like adding a bunch more examples to the docs and adding use cases. So if you have like a burning use case that you actually want to see covered, or want to be in the docs, like feel free to reach out with us, reach out to us with that. All right.
Yeah, definitely. I have gotten some good issues about scripting functions. I feel like they are sometimes overlooked. There are only like, when I see the response, I often see like a lot of serial QL stuff and what that serial functions. I understand that's the major thing of the database, of course, serial QL. And obviously keep using serial QL. But like, there is a lot of good stuff with those scripting functions, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in that sense, like, what would be kind of like the top thing that you would personally reach for the scripting functions to do?
Well, I think like if we look at it, like there is now fetch, and you can basically make some kind of API, like maybe you can half already do like kind of sort of embedded functions where you make it very simple, like stored query, which is just a function, and have that do complex stuff and fetch a website maybe, or something like that. I think you can do some very interesting stuff with those. Like,
yep, no, absolutely. And I just kind of want to bring up the kind of like serial QL documentation, because we was talking about the so here we have the documentation, and under scripting functions we have kind of like the examples that we've covered, like with the argument, and then here we have the kind of like async functions, and we have the kind of fetch. So we have an example here in the documentation. And in this example, we're kind of like grabbing things from this API. And so we're fetching it into the JavaScript context and then making it available to SerialDB. Now, in one sense, we have also the HTTP functions, which can also grab stuff from an API. Do you have any opinion about like the difference there?
Well, I think the HTTP functions are a bit more limited. not
Yeah, definitely.
100% familiar with it. I don't think you can
Yeah.
like add headers, and with the fetch. The fetch is like normal JavaScript fetch. You can create custom methods. You can add custom headers.
Yep.
Like you're more flexible in what kind of data you're putting into the body. Like you can send raw bytes if you want to. So in
Yeah,
that way,
no.
that's all a bit more tougher to do with the serial call functions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The and in another sense, like the HTTP functions, you can do like the post and get, but it's very limited in what it can do. You can't like authenticate. You can't like send a bunch of stuff. Whereas this is more kind of like fully fetched, like more kind of like things you can do in it. But also, you can also disable the HTTP functions if anybody's wondering, because of course you don't want people to just like randomly get stuff from the internet. But in terms of the kind of like limitations when it comes to the fetch here, like what is there something you can't do that you could do in normal fetch? Like are there some edge
Yes.
cases that people need to be aware of?
Yes, we currently don't have any of the stream JavaScript stream API, so you can't stream your body in. You need to just await it in one time, get a full text and bytes. That's the only way you can get the body. You also can't like create form data. There is like if you create form data with JavaScript, you send it as the MIME type multi-part form data, which also has a bunch of like streaming. It's kind of designed to allow you to stream files and that kind of stuff. That's all not implemented. Yeah, mostly because it's hard to do. It's I have been working on it, but well, implementing those stream is very complex. It's a large spec, so we currently just haven't done it. And there is also some question: do you want to stream functions? Like you kind of want your queries to respond quickly, so do you want to have a long like a download which takes an hour, for instance? Do you want to have that as a function?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I mean, like, if anybody watching either now or later has an opinion on that, we'd love to hear that. Because it is kind of like also tricky, right? When you think of like, because this is happening like within the transactional model of a database. And it is of course challenging if you have this like very long running transaction that is doing some complicated stuff. And yeah, so that's definitely kind of interesting to see like what should we kind of like support. So like, yeah, definitely if anybody has an opinion on that, we'd love to hear it. But in terms of like the built-in functions, so is there kind of like more things planned here, or are we kind of like stabilizing and kind of like optimizing just what is here so far?
Well, what we currently have is kind of like we're kind of still looking at what people want to use before. Like I think the fetch is very useful. Apart from that, like you can basically do anything with the database, so that's already very useful. Like so, I have been looking at what maybe other web APIs would be useful to implement, and like at the moment, I'm thinking we already have like a good feature set here. But definitely, if there is somebody who has a use case that in some web API they think that might be useful to add, then definitely send us a feature request, and we'll definitely look at it. But for now, I think this is already a good set. Like, I don't have anything planned other than making maybe the current use somewhat more ergonomic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just kind of like on that point, like everything we add in that is not useful to people is kind of like tech that we need to maintain. And so we really appreciate kind of like knowing what people actually want and like what people are using, so we can kind of like spend more time there, and kind of like optimize that rather than just kind of like doing something that nobody wants or is using. But yeah, so we're kind of like nearing the end of the stream. Is there any kind of like final thing, final comments, final questions from the audience? Nope, doesn't seem like it. All right. Well, thank you, Mies, for joining on the stream. It's been really fascinating to kind of like chat with you about the embedded JavaScript functions and kind of get more perspective on this, and also just kind of like share some of the work that you have been doing. Mies have been doing a ton of stuff internally at SerialDB, and we want to make sure that like the amazing stuff that we're doing is actually like promoted, and you actually get a chance to see all of this. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll see you on the next stream.